Hi class, so in this lecture we're going to get a little overview of psychology as a scientific field, so kind of get some of those basic elements, and then we're going to look at kind of the early history of psychology. So I say the prehistory because we're actually going to set ourselves up and look at the before, what influenced psychology to help it become that scientific field there in the 1900s. Alright, so psychology is a science. It's the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. And so basically what we're saying is psychology is the study of mind and behavior. It's the study of us. It's how we think, how we act, and how we engage each other. However, in saying that, psychology is not just interested in human thought and behavior and that human mind-body connection. We're actually interested in animal thought and behavior too. So psychology doesn't just study human behavior and mental processes, it studies all behavior and mental processes. So that's a key point to keep in mind there, guys, because it's not just about humans, even though a big part of it is looking at what makes us human. Psychology, you know, we expand beyond our species to help in that endeavor. So psychology is actually, it's a Greek word. It means the study of the soul. Ology is always study of. That's why I do those scientific fields. It's always, you know, archaeology, philosophy. Oh no, wait, sorry, wrong one. Archaeology, anthropology, you know, the study of that. And psyche is the Greek word for soul, so that's why we call it the study of the soul. And basically, even though psychology wasn't introduced until the 1900s as a scientific field, we could say that is actually an old field, because when you go across the world and you look at all cultures and you look at all time periods, people were always asking questions about what makes us human. People were always looking at, you know, this mind-body connection. And then, of course, you know, we have those big questions. Who are we? Why are we here? What do we think? What we do? Why do people do bad things? Why are some people naturally altruistic? And so on. And so, you know, all those burning questions, psychology attempts to answer in one form or another. Alright, so psychology has four main goals. Depending on what subfield you're in, the goals, they change just slightly, but the overall purpose is the same. Psychology's four goals are to describe, explain, predict, and control behavior. That's what those four goals are in reference to. So, you know, psychologists, we want to describe, observe that behavior we are seeing. Then we want to explain what that behavior is, and then we want to predict it, as in, you know, we want to try to say, in this situation, this is how these people are going to react based on our observations and experiments. And then that way, then we can kind of control behavior. So that's when you start getting into like social guidelines and social expectations and rules and things like reward systems. You know, all those are ways to kind of control our behavior. And, you know, that's a good thing, because as human beings, we're social creatures. We're meant to get along with each other. And at the same time, being human means that we also have this really dark side too. And so, you know, we have these social rules and obligations set into place so that we keep society moving, and we keep that social contract between all of us of just, you know, knowing that, hey, we need each other for survival. And so there are certain ways that we must behave with each other, you know, for me to survive and for you to survive. And so that's kind of that control aspect. But once again, all the goals of psychology relate to behavior. Because psychology is a science, we do use the scientific method. And basically the scientific method, it's the process that all researchers, all scientists use, and it's just a way to go about asking and answering questions. And for psychology specifically, especially, I guess would be more to say, because all sciences, they do experiments and make observations, but in psychology, those are definitely critical parts of looking at that mind-body connection. And then research all starts with a question, and that question leads to more research, testing, more research, conclusions. That's kind of the scientific method. So there are 5 steps to the scientific method. The first one is ask a question. So that would be like your thesis statement. You come up with that question. You do that background research, and then based on your background research, then you create your hypothesis, and that would in fact be your theses. So basically what you do is you take that question and you turn it around to a statement, and that then is your hypothesis. That's your theses. And then so you go about proving or disproving that thesis by doing experiments. And then based on those experiments, you're going to get a bunch of data, you're going to analyze that data, and then you're going to come to a conclusion. And so when you come to that conclusion, you're either proving your thesis correct or you're disproving it correct. And even in disproving it correct, sometimes that's not always a bad thing. We still learn something from that. So when you draw that conclusion based on all these experiments, questions, and data that you have collected, it's a way to communicate the results of that that research. And then that helps people be able to do that research with other types of people. It helps for people to expound upon that research, and then ultimately, it just all helps us to learn more about what it means to be human. Alright, so like I said, with psychology, we study the mind and body connection, and we do that with both animals and human beings. And also in looking at that mind-body connection, we have to think about how things like belief systems, cultures, social economic status, upbringings, and just kind of those things that are unique to us as humans and as individuals. We're looking at how all those relate to our mind and mind-body connection, how, and we're also looking at how our emotions play a role in that too, because we know that this is all kind of a holistic process, right? Being human beings, we're not just made up of one thing. We have all these different things that we're made up, and they all affect how we think, how we behave, and then in turn how we engage each other. Alright, so psychology did start officially as a science in excuse me, in Germany, but what I want to do here, we'll talk about that in another video, but what I want to do here is talk a little bit about the early history of American psychology. So basically, even in the beginning of psychology and kind of pre-psychology, this emphasis on people's belief systems, and then kind of comparing those to other people's belief system, using those as the foundation for scientific inquiry. That was a big part of science, and it still is a big part of science, because why? We all have belief systems in one way or form, right? And it's okay that we have a diversity of belief systems. That's one of the cool things that makes us human too. And that's one of the cool things about psychology, because when we look at it, we see a lot of, of course we have a lot of Western ideology and science in there, but we also have a lot of Eastern philosophy that influences psychology. So when psychology first started in America, there really was this big emphasis on belief systems. And it was basically just people kind of playing around and exploring different types of belief systems. So people were kind of getting big into Eastern philosophies. And it isn't really until like the 60s that we start getting more of those Eastern philosophies like meditation, yoga, Reiki into psychology. Back here in the beginning, it was kind of more of this idea of mysticism. Mysticism was early hypnosis. It kind of came from the Middle East, eastern part of the world, a lot of Eastern philosophy involved in the process of it. And so we see that hitting the American scene, and people were really fascinated with that. We see things like seances, spirit boards, so like the Ouija board that actually started out as a game. That would be the little game people would play in their parlor. and there was no concept. Now with that Christian emphasis that is put on the Ouija boards of there just being about demons and the devil, when they first came out, nobody thought that way. It was just a fun way to play around and like talk to your dead ancestors, because people had this real big fascination with what happens after death, and just this emphasis on life after death. And so we also see the beginning of photography, and so ghost photos were a big thing. And then another big popular thing is that when someone would die, they would actually dress them up and take pictures of dead people with the living family members. That was really popular too for when babies died. So you would have this family and you would have a baby sitting, and if you ever seen those old photos, you'll kind of be like, that little baby doesn't look quite right, and is that because of the photography? It's like, no, more than likely it's because the child had already passed away. They were ghost, I think they did just call them ghost pictures, or no, they didn't. I can't remember what they call them, but they were very popular. People would keep photo albums full of their deceased relatives, and maybe that sounds really weird and bizarre to us today, that our just a few generations ago ancestors did these kind of things. But you got to think, once again, this was all kind of just fun stuff, and it was just a way for people to explore these unknown parts of living in this reality, and things like consciousness and what it means to be human. Alright, so since we know that psychology is actually a Greek word, within that would help us understand that it's really influenced by Greek philosophy. So a lot of Greek philosophy, Eastern philosophy, mixed with Western philosophy and kind of Western Christianity, we would say. And those were all the beginnings, the working foundation for psychology. And then, like I said, because being human doesn't mean that we're just made up of one thing. Being human is a very dynamic process. We're constantly changing, and our thoughts are constantly changing, and we're also very unique as far as our individual personalities go, and as far as our cultures and ideologies, and like all those other things I mentioned earlier, and just what we are taught to think and how we are taught to think. These are all things that psychology is interested in examining. Alright, so we see that those early foundation for psychology, those Eastern philosophies, those Greek philosophies, and then kind of, like I said, Western Christianity. So based on all three of those texts and teachings, we start to get an overview of kind of human behavior and different things going on with that mind-body connection, right? That's where we get things like the soul, we get our emotions, and all that stuff like that. Alright, so basically before the Protestant Reformation and the invention of the Gutenberg printing press, I'm so bad with dates, I think this would be in about the 1800s, but kind of before that, people, and they didn't have access to information like we did. Basically the majority of people, they couldn't even read or write. So, books were very limited too. So people had limited understanding of their past and kind of what it meant to be human. And then what happens, we kind of get into the science, Europe starts going out, exploring other parts of the world there in the 1400s. By the 1700s, we have the Age of Enlightenment, so we have an explosion in science in Western culture, right? And that's where we really start to see, our endeavors in learning about what it means to be human and this mind-body connection kick in. But we're going to start back in the 1600s with Francis Bacon and with Johannes Kepler. So Johannes Kepler was an early kind of astronomer, we could say. He was one of the first guys who he learned how to use a telescope. He invented the telescope. He monitored the planets. And why he's important to psychology, because of his invention of the telescope. With that led to studies in optics and just learning about how the human eye worked. And so, we learned when actually we see everything like backwards, upside down. That's why it's inverted. So light and images come in and they're reflected off the back of our eyes, our retina's there, and then our eyes and our brain push it back out in a way that we can make sense of. So Pretty interesting to think about there. And it just, once again, so, how does, our brain process what we really see and what we really call reality? How does consciousness play a role in that? These are all exciting things that we look at in the field of psychology. And Kepler's invention of the telescope is just kind of one little endeavor in that direction there. And then Francis Bacon, I always like to bring him in because he was truly a Renaissance man, if you could say that. I mean, he was into everything. He was into religion, he was into politics, he was into culture, travel, He did a lot of stuff in like the English Parliament and with the kings and queens over there, and then he came over here to America and he was advocating like rights for the 13 colonies and just doing just a bunch of different stuff. And he was really important because with all his different endeavors when it came to scientific things, he was a big proponent of using the scientific method. So this was kind of like in the beginning when they were first trying to find a way to make sense of all this data and these questions that they were asking, and then they invented, say, well, if everybody does it based on these 5 steps, then it's just going to make more sense to everybody. And so Francis Bacon was really big on advocating that, and then like I said, he just did a lot of great stuff there. Next we have Rene Descartes, and he is the father of modern Western philosophy. Very influential figure in many different fields, ranging from philosophy to psychology to political science, and you name it. Descartes is always kind of at the heart of everything. And he is actually the one that introduced this idea of the mind-body connection and kind of like innate ideas, meaning that what we think affects how we behave. So for Descartes, he believed that that reality was composed of just this intelligence. So it was this logical structure, and then intelligent beings could pick up on it. So I kind of said that backwards, my bad, guys. So he believed that reality was like this logical structure, and that things, it was just naturally placed in this logical order, and if you were intelligent enough, you kind of picked up off of that. So our experiences in life, before Descartes, we were with Aristotle and say that everything, if it wasn't real if we didn't experience this with just those 5 basic senses, and we actually have 5 to 6 or 7 more senses. We'll talk about that in class. But, so Aristotle and before Descartes, we just thought that was our only perception of reality. So they didn't really get into, when you start getting into looking at the mind with the ancient Greeks, we go more into anything that was up in your mind was kind of abnormal and kind of mental disorder for them. But because everything was based on your 5 senses. If you couldn't see it, taste it, touch it, or hear it, then it wasn't real. But Descartes was like, wait a minute, there are kind of experiences and senses we have that are beyond that, and they're not just these abnormal mental disorder types of senses. They're part of the natural intelligence. Excuse me. Natural intelligence, I still can't say it, natural intelligence, and part of just that universal truth and structure, just that's how the universe is set up by that divine creator. For Descartes, it would have been a divine creator. Alright, and then Descartes is famous for saying, I think, therefore I am, and it's basically, I think that I exist, so therefore I know that I exist. So, like you see that difference there, because for Aristotle and before that, it would have been like, doesn't matter what you think. Did you taste it? Did you feel it? Did you look at it? That would be more of how you knew you exist. But then Descartes' like, no, wait, there's something going on in our brains that affects that too. Alright, and next we get to John Locke. And John Locke we actually have to talk about in regard to Descartes and then Thomas Hobbes. So John Locke actually rejected Descartes' ideas. He said that humans are born blank slates and they had to be taught everything. Whereas Descartes was like, because of this intricate logical structure, we're kind of already born kind of pre-programmed, is what he's saying. And Locke was like, nah, I don't think so. You know, he's like, we're born these blank slates, and you know, everything that we learn, everything that we think, everything that we do, society teaches to us. So that idea of being born a blank slate, he called the tabula rasa. I'm sorry guys, that's R-O-S-A, not rasa, my bad. And when you talk about Locke, it's you have to talk about Hobbes too, and Descartes, because these are the three main figures when we get into the nature versus nurture debate, which has to do with, are humans, you know, are humans purely good by nature? Are they purely bad by nature? Are we born blank slates that society fills up, so we have no real independence or real unique individuality about us, you know, or is it that other side? No, wait a minute, there is something else going on. You know, society does inform us and shape us in some ways, but we all kind of have a little bag of stuff that we start out with, right? And so when it comes to Locke and Hobbes, they were really kind of famous in their time there, about 1700s, at 16, I think Leviathan, 1642, 1700s, and they would just go back and forth with each other on this nature versus nurture, and this, are humans good or bad by nature? Innately debate. They went around that, and that's really important because you know, this debate of nature versus nurture is a key, you know, kind of a key principle when it comes to studying human behavior, because you know, we do kind of have to look at, when does it start, when can, you know, when does consciousness come into play? Those of course have to do with issues of you know, prenatal, being in the womb too. You know, how can we, where do we really start being human in the development of life? So you know, all of that has that foundation and that nurture versus nature debate. I've already kind of talked about this stuff here, guys, so I'm not going to go over too much more on this. Just to be on, like I said, you know, before the Age of Enlightenment, the beginning there of science, you know, we see science and religion kind of battling each other. But like I said, in many ways, a lot of people were combining the two, and you know, they were really looking at cultural diversity and kind of looking at how other people did it. So a lot of these early psychologists, they were really studied in cultural diversity. People like William James, who is considered the father of American psychology. He studied a lot of different cultures, traveled to a lot of different cultures. Carl Jung, he's a pretty famous psychologist, and so he is another one that knew a lot about different cultures. He was really big into studying Eastern philosophies. He especially liked the I Ching, and then he spent a lot of time on the African continent with different African cultures, you know, studying out and kind of studying and hanging out with them. Alright, so we know that psychology is concerned with how we think and behave as humans, because, you know, as humans we have thoughts, we have emotions, we have imagination, we have reasoning, and, you know, these are all those mental processes that we have, those cognitive processes. And, you know, we say that we call it thinking, we call it cognition, cognitive processes, we call it consciousness, we call it mind, spirit, soul, essence, and, you know, what really makes us human beings? What is this thing called consciousness? You know, that's something that we have debated since prehistory, and we know that because of belief systems once again. And so when we look back into ancient prehistory, we're looking at the time before writing, archaeologists have found, you know, lots of burials, lots of things like mounds and other types of effigies and artifacts that show that, you know, our obsession with what comes after this life, what we call death in the afterlife, you know, that's kind of always been a part of what makes us human. And when we look at religion, A famous anthropologist, E.B. Tyler, simply defined that as a belief in the supernatural. And, that belief, like I said, since, pretty much the first humans, comes from that quest just to understand consciousness, what is consciousness, and kind of just understanding why we are even here in this world, right? And then, like I said, we know it started with those ancient philosophies, stories like Homer's Iliad, stories of the gods, all the stories of the gods. They were just ways to explain human behavior, a human consciousness, kind of explain human emotions too, and that really laid the foundation for the beginning of philosophy. And when we look at the ancient Greeks, we're really looking at Plato and Aristotle. They were both very concerned with the meaning of life, what it meant to be human. For Plato, and then we see kind of a battle between the mind-body connection. So with the ancient Greeks, they were a very one-track thinking. It couldn't be a combination. It was either the body or the mind did it, okay? So for Plato, he thought that the brain was the center of mental processes. Then, of course, we have emotions too, right? So we got to throw in those things like our hearts and our souls. And so Aristotle thought that kind of our heart was more the center of our mental processes. And then that soul, that consciousness, that was the root for all thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. And so based off their early works, we start getting more ideas of just how we think consciousness is and how it formed. I'm just done that. Oh, okay. Well, we're almost done. I was gonna say we've already gone over this too. So, like I said, once we get into those Eastern philosophies as the foundation for psychology too, since the age of contact and those Western explorers, they were going out. Then we have the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, and then right there at the beginning, the Enlightenment, what we start to see is we see all these social sciences working together. So psychology, anthropology, archaeology. Archaeology was very instrumental in the beginning of the Enlightenment period for helping us learn a lot about early human behavior, right? And so, that's the information that psychologists were using, geologists and the biologists. It's like everybody, they were kind of doing their own little thing, but they were all sharing their ideas. So everybody got to read all of it, and then that helped like springboard then, their little particular interest in that study of, looking at how the world works, or looking at how animals or us animals, humans work, right? And so, like I said, so archaeology played a big role of that in the beginning, and it's just, like I said, another way of asking these questions about what it is to be human and why we're here, how that changes, how do we get along with each other, how do we do that better, how do we not do bad, and all those questions that we ask in life. Psychology is really looking at that, and I think we will see as we go through class that psychology is more influential in our life than we might initially perceive, and it's very instrumental in things like education system, the penal system, just media and advertisements. Actually, media and advertisement, those fields started with psychologists, and or maybe we could say it was the psychologists made those fields thrive because they gave them the keys to understanding human behavior. They told them how to get people to do what they wanted, to buy their stuff or to vote a certain way, and so on and so forth, those kind of things like that. So you'll really see how influential psychology is in our life, and hopefully with this little background of psychology, it starts to get us thinking about all these questions and these ideas of what it means to be human. And if you take anything out of class, if you don't learn anything about psychology, I at least hope that you learn something about yourself, because because psychology is really good about helping us learn about ourselves too. And so, based on all this background information, then psychology was finally able to insert itself as its own science there at the beginning of the 1900s, and it was really focused on this idea of obsession, obsession of trying to figure out just what consciousness is and how scientists should go about studying it. So in our next video, we will look at the schools of psychological thought, and those are basically just the different theories in psychology that inform us today. And they started with the ideas of structuralism and functionalism. And so those were the first schools of thought that created the first theories and methodologies that psychologists use and improve upon today. And then there is my reference slide, just to give you guys an example of how to set up a book in APA. Since this is a really old book and it's part of a volume, it's a little weird, tricky looking one there. And I would suggest you looking at the video of basics of APA. I've got some really short, concise information there on how you can easily include those APA citations and references in all of your work, so that you hit those marks and so that you don't dip into those fields of plagiarism. So check that video out too, you guys. If you need anything in class, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. I am here to help with anything you guys need. Your success is important to me. I'm super excited to be starting this semester, and yeah guys, if you need anything, just reach out to me. Thanks, bye.